March 1944. The sky above Berlin is a bruised gray, streaked with contrails that twist like smoke from invisible fires. Far below, the city lies under a blanket of haze, the echo of sirens rolling through its streets, once again at 20,000 feet. Silver shapes crawl through the clouds. The American B-17s, their formations are tight. Steady, methodical inside each bomber, men sit in silence. The rhythmic hum of engines their only comfort for months. These raids had been suicide runs. The Luftwaffe owned the sky. And every mission to Berlin meant another burning fortress spiraling down. But today, something is different as German pilots dive from the sun. Their radios crackle with laughter and routine confidence until shadows appear behind the bombers. Sleek, fast, unfamiliar, the P-51 Mustangs. Long-range escorts that were never supposed to reach Berlin. The hunters have just become the hunted. The German pilots pull hard on their sticks, disbelief mixing with sudden fear, as the skies over the Reich's capital erupt in trails of smoke and fire. The age of the Luftwaffe's dominance is ending. By early 1943, the air war over Europe had become a brutal test of endurance, a war of attrition fought in the thin, frozen air above the Reich. The Allies believed strategic bombing could cripple Germany's capacity to fight. Factories, refineries, rail yards, all would be ground into rubble until the Nazi war machine collapsed from within. But belief came at a staggering cost. Every daylight raid deep into Germany meant dozens of bombers lost. Entire crews vanished in flames or parachuted into captivity, without fighter escorts that could follow them all the way to their targets. The flying fortresses and liberators were left merely defenseless once the short-ranged P-47s and P-38s turned back inside the Reich. The Luftwaffe was confident. Its twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf-110s and nimble FW-190s formed a deadly shield. Intercept formations rose in coordinated waves. Directed by a sophisticated radar network, German Fighter Command, Jagdgeschwader, treated incoming bomber streams as predictable prey to them. America's daylight bombing doctrine looked naive. The idea that slow, heavily armed bombers could fight their way unescorted through German airspace seemed absurd, and for a time, it was the numbers told the story. During the second raid on Schweinfurt in October 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 of its 291 bombers, more than 500 men in a single day. Photographs of empty hardstands in England told commanders what statistics could not. Crews spoke of skies filled with burning fortresses, wings folding, engines trailing smoke, men bailing out into black nothingness. It was clear, unless the bombers could be protected, daylight bombing would die. Meanwhile, deep within Allied planning circles, the debate raged. Some argued for abandoning daylight missions altogether. Others insisted that precision bombing, striking factories rather than cities, was the only moral and effective path to victory. But without long-range fighter support, precision was a death sentence. In the winter of 1943, the Allies faced a strategic crisis. They were winning in North Africa and Italy, but over Germany, they were bleeding. The Luftwaffe remained fierce, experienced, and confident. German aces like Adolf Galland and Walter Dahl boasted kill counts that dwarfed their opponents. Each loss of a bomber meant 10 skilled airmen gone forever, a toll the United States could not sustain indefinitely. Then, in the factories and airfields of Britain and America, a quiet revolution began to take shape. Engineers and pilots had been testing a new aircraft, a sleek, low-drag design built around one of the most advanced engines of the war, the Rolls-Royce Merlin. This combination gave it speed, altitude, and range no other fighter could match. Initially dismissed as an experimental escort, it was soon proving it could fly deep into enemy territory, and back the aircraft's name was the P-51 Mustang. As prototypes began to arrive in England, veteran bomber crews watched its long, graceful wings with cautious hope. Some called it the angel at the edge of the world. Others simply prayed it could keep up, but for now. In early 1944, the Luftwaffe still ruled the heart of Europe. German pilots flew confident and fast. Their bases spread across France, Holland, and the Reich itself. Every day they rose to meet the bombers head-on, diving through gunfire. Certain of superiority, that certainty, that sense of ownership over the skies, would soon meet its reckoning, because within weeks, the first full squadrons of P-51 Mustangs would take flight over Europe, and everything the Luftwaffe believed about air power was about to be rewritten by February 1944. The 8th Air Force had begun integrating its new guardian, the P-51 Mustang, into regular escort missions. It was sleek, fast, and astonishingly efficient at high altitude with its Merlin engine. It could fly more than 1,600 kilometers without refueling, escorting bombers from England deep into the industrial heart of Germany, all the way to Berlin and back for the first time in the war. The Allied bombers would not have to face the Luftwaffe alone. The shift began quietly. Almost experimentally, mixed formations of P-47s, P-38s, and a handful of P-51s escorted bomber streams toward key industrial targets in central Germany. Reports returned from the air, not only of success, but of something deeper. Surprised Luftwaffe pilots were suddenly encountering enemy fighters where none had ever appeared before. Over Leipzig, over Brunswick, over the Ruhr, they were stunned until then. The German defense system was predictable. Fighters attacked the bombers once the escorts turned back near the Rhine. But now, when they dived into a formation, Mustangs were already waiting, high, fast, and patient. American commanders quickly recognized what they had: a fighter that could not only escort, but dominate under the leadership of General James Doolittle. The U.S. changed its strategy. Instead of keeping the Mustangs close to the bombers, Doolittle unleashed them, giving pilots the freedom to seek and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it formed up. It was a revolutionary order. Destroy the German Air Force by destroying its fighters. The Sky War had shifted from defense to offense. Now the Mustangs prowled ahead of the bombers, sweeping airfields, breaking up intercept formations before they could even climb to altitude. Squadrons like the 357th and 4th Fighter Group carved new legends into the European skies. German intelligence tried to adapt, but even the best intercept tactics began to crumble. The P-51s climbed higher, turned faster, and fought longer with their drop tanks. They could outlast nearly any opponent, and their 50 caliber guns, 6 in total, tore through even the armored frames of FW-19OS for the Luftwaffe. It was the beginning of exhaustion. Every mission now meant risk. Even before the bombers arrived, supply shortages deepened. Fuel was scarce. Replacement pilots rushed into battle after barely 20 hours of flight training. Meanwhile, the Americans kept coming, wave after wave, with endless replacements and new machines. By spring 1944, the Air War's balance of power had inverted. The once invincible German fighter arm was bleeding from 1,000 cuts, its veterans falling one by one in ready rooms across France and Germany. Morale wavered. Young pilots spoke in whispers of silver fighters that seemed to appear from nowhere. Faster, deadlier, unstoppable. Berlin itself, the untouchable capital, was now within reach of escorted bombers. And in March, as formation after formation crossed into the Reich's heartland, German radar stations tracked something unprecedented: hundreds of Mustangs flying side by side with the bombers. For the Luftwaffe, the realization came too late. Every intercept, every defensive climb, now carried the risk of ambush. Where they had once laughed at the lumbering bombers, they now faced a new predator, one that followed them home, attacked their bases, and waited for them to land. The age of the hunter had turned into the age of the hunted, and as the spring of 1944 gave way to summer, the P-51 Mustang would not only guard the skies above the bombers, it would begin to break the Luftwaffe apart, piece by piece. The war in the air had entered its decisive phase for years. The men of the 8th Air Force had lived by a grim arithmetic. You could measure a bomber crew's life expectancy not in months, but in missions. 25 was the magic number. The point when a man might finally go home, but few ever reached it. In the barracks across England, empty bunks told the story. Crews would fly out at dawn, faces pale in the cold, and by evening, only silence and folded blankets remained. The Luftwaffe's fighters, swift and merciless, turned the daylight bombing campaign into a lottery of survival. Then, slowly, word began to spread. New escorts, faster, longer-legged, finally capable of staying with the formations all the way to Berlin. Skepticism was natural. Every new promise had been paid for in blood before. But when the first P-51s appeared outside the bomber windows, the effect was electric. Men stared through gun turrets at the sleek fighters gliding beside them, sunlight flashing off their wings. Hope, something many had forgotten, crept back into the cockpit. One waist gunner later wrote, "When we saw them, it was like the sky belonged to us again." That moment, a change not in machinery but in morale, was one of the most profound shifts of the air war for the Luftwaffe pilots. It was the opposite experience. They had grown used to dominance, to dictating the terms of combat, but when they dived through bomber formations and found Mustangs waiting in the sun above, confidence turned to alarm. Radio chatter filled with disbelief. No one had ever seen escorts this far east before. In that instant, the hunters understood what it meant to be trapped inside their own sky. Before the Mustangs, every daylight raid followed a pattern the Luftwaffe had mastered. Fighters would climb in waves, form attack boxes, strike in coordinated head-on assaults, and peel away. German controllers read radar tracks like chessboards, each move predictable. Each counter prepared. The introduction of the P-51 shattered that rhythm. General Doolittle's order, "Go find them before they find us," freed Allied pilots from the rigid doctrine of close escort. Instead of waiting beside the bombers, they roamed ahead, sweeping airfields, climbing into the sun, disrupting formations before they could gather tactics. Once based on certainty, now dissolved into chaos. German pilots scrambled and found themselves ambushed during climb-out. Squadron leaders tried to form cohesive strikes, but were intercepted before reaching altitude. The Mustangs were everywhere, above, behind, and sometimes even circling their own airfields. This change marked the end of Luftwaffe coordination. What had been a chess game became a brawl. Meanwhile, the P-51 pilots adopted the aggressive fighter sweep mentality, a hunt rather than a defense. Their agility at altitude allowed them to dictate the fight at over 25,000 feet. They still retained climb power and roll control unmatched by the FW-190 or BF-109. The tactical balance had reversed. The Luftwaffe no longer owned the initiative. German command tried countermeasures, heavier armament, rocket attacks, and vertical dives, but every adaptation came at a cost. Heavier planes turned slower. Rocket-equipped 190s could only make one pass before diving away. The Mustangs, light and relentless, followed them down within weeks. Luftwaffe commanders realized that their famed Jag-Jeshwater formations, the pride of the Reich's air defense, were no longer cohesive strike groups. They were isolated fragments fighting for survival. And over the ruins of that broken pattern, the bombers kept coming at. The heart of the Mustang's transformation was a single engineering decision: the replacement of its original Allison engine with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin. It turned a good aircraft into a great one. Merlin allowed the P-51 to maintain power at high altitude, the exact zone where bombers and interceptors fought. Its laminar flow wing design reduced drag, giving it both speed and range. With drop tanks, it could fly over 1,600 kilometers, a figure no other Allied fighter could touch for bomber crews. This meant protection where they needed it most, deep inside the Reich. The P-51 also introduced a subtle but decisive psychological weapon. Endurance. German pilots, bound by fuel shortages, often had minutes to fight before returning to base. Mustangs could linger, they could wait, they could follow home. Its cockpit visibility, control harmony, and .50 caliber armament gave pilots the ability to attack and escape with precision. And its speed, nearly 440 miles per hour at altitude, made it a nightmare for opponents. Mustang's technological advantage was not just about performance metrics. It represented the full industrial might of the Allied war machine. Design, mass production, and logistical coordination converging into one lethal instrument, where the Luftwaffe's technology had peaked with refinements. The Allies had evolved by the time German engineers fielded the Me-262 jet. It was already too late. The skies were owned, the factories burning. The fuel lines severed. The Mustang had turned the tide long before the jet could save the Reich, and soon it would prove that dominance in the air could decide victory on the ground. The Americans knew they were bleeding. Every mission into Germany cost bombers and men. A single daylight raid could see 60 planes vanish into the smoke. Hundreds of airmen killed or captured, yet Washington and London refused to stop. The air offensive had to continue, because halting it meant surrendering the initiative to Hitler's Luftwaffe. By mid-1943, the Allies had built a massive network of bases across England. Airfields like Bassingbourn, Thorpe Abbotts, and Ridgewell became cities of concrete and steel, filled with the droning heartbeat of four-engine bombers. The U.S. 8th Air Force was expanding into a giant every week. New crews arrived, fresh-faced boys from Texas, Ohio, and California, trained to fly 10-hour missions into one of the most dangerous skies on Earth. Their leaders, Generals Ira Eaker and Karl Spaatz, believed in precision bombing, hitting Germany's factories, refineries, and rail lines in daylight. When they could see their targets, it was bold, it was logical, and it was deadly, because the Luftwaffe was waiting. By 1943, the German air defense system was one of the most sophisticated in the world. Radar chains stretched from the French coast to Berlin, giving early warnings of Allied formations. Controllers on the ground guided squadrons of interceptors, Bf-109s, FW-190s, and even twin-engine Zersterers, straight into the bomber streams. Tactic was ruthless, but effective. German fighters didn't need to outmaneuver the bombers. They simply attacked in head-on formations, filling the air with 20 mm and 30 mm cannon shells. One hit to an engine or fuel tank could turn a flying fortress into a ball of fire, and so, mission after mission, the 8th Air Force paid in blood. On August 17, 1943, the Americans launched the first deep strike into Germany, the famous Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid. It was meant to cripple Germany's aircraft industry by hitting ball bearing plants and Messerschmitt factories instead. It became a massacre. 60 bombers went down that day. 600 men never returned. The survivors limped back to England, wings shredded, fuselages riddled with holes, engines coughing smoke still. The order came, go again. In October, the Americans tried Schweinfurt once more. That time, they lost another 60 aircraft. The losses were so catastrophic that the deep raids were temporarily halted in Berlin. Goering smiled. He told his staff, "The Americans can't continue these losses. They'll stop soon. The Reich is safe." For a moment, he was right. The problem wasn't courage, it was reach. The bombers could fly to the heart of Germany, but their escorts couldn't. P-47, Thunderbolt, and P-38 Lightning were powerful, but their range was too short past the Rhine. They had to turn back, leaving the bombers alone. For the final hours, exactly when the Luftwaffe struck hardest, the German pilots called it the Kampf ohne Begleitung, the battle without escort. It was their hunting ground. Every American crew knew it. They could almost feel it. The moment their P-47 escorts peeled away, tipping their wings in farewell before heading home. From that second onward, the sky belonged to the enemy. The bomber crews faced the rest of the mission alone, wave after wave of fighters. Black flak exploding around them, oxygen freezing in their masks. Engines coughing blood at that stage of the war. The U.S. daylight bombing campaign hung by a thread. Morale was brittle. Crews spoke of the Black Week. 7 days of missions that cost hundreds of planes in the command rooms. The generals debated halting deep operations altogether, but deep inside the American aircraft industry, a new answer was already being built, sleek, elegant, and deadly. It was the fighter that would turn the war in the air upside down. North American P-51 Mustang, born from a British request, refined by American innovation, and powered by the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. It combined everything the Allies had been missing: speed, altitude, and above all, range. By late 1943, the first Mustangs began arriving in England. At first, they were met with skepticism. The P-47 pilots called them pretty birds, untested, unproven, too light to survive a duel with German fighters. But within months, the P-51 would rewrite air combat history. The Luftwaffe didn't know it yet, but the balance of power in the skies was about to shift forever, and that shift would begin where it mattered most. Above Berlin, the engines of the new Mustangs roared to life, silver wings, glinting over frozen English runways, for the airmen of the 8th Air Force. Every mission into Germany was a gamble with death. They were young, most in their early 20s. Yet each carried the weight of a nation's expectations on their shoulders. Before dawn, they would gather in briefing huts filled with cigarette smoke and the low murmur of nerves. A curtain would be drawn back to reveal the target of the day. Schweinfurt, Bremen, Berlin. The groans that followed were not fear, but understanding. Everyone knew what those names meant: heavy flak German fighters, and almost certain casualties. Each man carried good luck charms, a photo, a coin, a Bible. The ground crews would paint names on the bombers: Memphis Belle, Little Miss Mischief, Hell's Angels. These weren't just machines. They were lifelines once airborne. Formation flying became a brutal test of endurance. Temperatures at 25,000 feet could plunge to 40 below zero. Frostbite was common. Oxygen masks froze solid, and yet discipline held. Tight formations, synchronized turns, and unwavering focus when German fighters appeared. It was chaos. Cannon shells tore through aluminum skins, engines exploded, and the air filled with burning fuel and falling debris. For the bomber crews, survival was mathematical: 10 men per plane, and a 1 in 4 chance of returning alive after 25 missions. Some called them the quartermasters of death, and yet they went again, because for them, the sky was duty. When the P-51s finally appeared, cutting through the clouds like silver lances, the relief was indescribable to the men inside the flying fortresses. Those fighters weren't just machines, they were salvation. American daylight bombing doctrine had always depended on precision and formation defense. The B-17 Flying Fortress, bristling with up to 13 machine guns, was designed to fight its way to the target. But by 1943, that theory was collapsing under the weight of German firepower. Tactically, the Luftwaffe had evolved. They no longer engaged in swirling dogfights. Instead, they launched massed head-on attacks. A Bf-109 diving straight toward a bomber formation could unleash devastating cannon fire before breaking away. Even a single hit to the nose section could disable the bombardier or destroy the cockpit in response. The Americans began experimenting. They altered formation spacing, changed altitudes, and coordinated strikes with Royal Air Force. Night raids to stretch the German defense network thin, but without escort fighters beyond the Rhine, nothing worked. The turning point came with the arrival of the P-51 Mustang and its radical use of long-range drop tanks. These external fuel tanks gave it endurance enough to reach Berlin, engage in combat, and still return home suddenly. The Luftwaffe's safe zones vanished. No longer could they wait for unescorted bombers. The P-51s now followed them every mile of the way. This new strategy was brutal in its effectiveness. American commanders like General James Doolittle issued clear orders. Your job is not to protect the bombers, your job is to destroy the Luftwaffe. The Mustangs swept ahead of the bomber streams, diving into German airfields, hunting fighters before they could even take off. The hunter had become the hunted. The skies over Germany, once dominated by black crosses, were now filled with silver wings. The P-51 Mustang was more than a fighter. It was a synthesis of engineering brilliance. It began in 1940 when Britain's purchasing commission approached North American Aviation, requesting new aircraft for the Royal Air Force. What they got was something revolutionary. Chief designer Edgar Schmude crafted an airframe with laminar flow wings, smooth, thin profiles that reduced drag and increased speed. But the early Mustang had a problem. Its Allison engine performed poorly at high altitudes, where most combat occurred. Then came the breakthrough. Engineers installed the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant used in the legendary Spitfire. The transformation was instant. The P-51 could now climb higher, fly faster, and cruise farther than any fighter before it, at over 400 miles per hour, and with a range exceeding 1,500 miles. With drop tanks, the Mustang became the long-sought solution to the daylight bombing crisis. It was armed with 650 caliber Browning machine guns, capable of tearing through any German aircraft. But what made it truly deadly was its agility. Pilots described it as an aircraft that thought with you. It could dive, climb, and roll with fluid precision, turning even novice pilots into predators. By the time the P-51B and later the iconic P-51D models entered combat, the Luftwaffe was already staggering under fuel shortages and veteran losses to German pilots used to easy kills. The sight of these sleek newcomers, fast, relentless, and seemingly untiring, was unnerving. Soon, entire fighter groups were equipped with Mustangs. Their tails were painted in unit colors: red for the 4th Fighter Group, blue for the 352nd, yellow for the 361st. Each became a symbol of death for the Luftwaffe. Tide of the air war was beginning to turn, not through sheer numbers, but through precision, innovation, and courage. And as 1944 dawned, that transformation would erupt in full force when the Mustangs followed the bombers deep into the heart of Germany and brought the fight directly to the skies above Berlin. Inside the cockpits of the Luftwaffe, the war had once felt like a game of certainty. For years, German pilots like Adolf Galland and Johann Steinhoff had dominated the skies. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s were feared. Sleek, lethal, and expertly flown by 1943. However, cracks began to form. The losses over the Ruhr and Hamburg were increasing. Each mission brought fewer returning pilots, and the replacements arriving from flight schools lacked experience. When the P-51 Mustang first appeared, it seemed at first like just another American aircraft, but that illusion vanished quickly. Luftwaffe pilots reported engagements at altitudes and ranges they had never seen before. The Mustangs climbed faster, dived steeper, and could stay in the air for hours longer, even after escorting bombers deep into Germany. They had the endurance to fight their way home in radio chatter intercepted by Allied intelligence. German pilots began referring to the P-51 as Die lange Schatten, the long shadow. It was everywhere. Impossible to shake. Veteran German ace Gunther Rahl would later recall, "We realized too late that this aircraft had changed everything. It took away our airspace, our confidence, and eventually, our hope." The psychological effect was devastating. Once confident interceptor wings now operated in constant fear. Takeoffs became suicide runs, with Mustangs waiting overhead to pounce. The hunter had become the hunted, and the Luftwaffe's reign of the skies was ending. One squadron at a time behind the success of the P-51 wasn't just an aircraft. It was a change in philosophy when General James "Jimmy" Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force's fighter operations in early 1944. He made one of the most radical decisions of the war until then. Fighter escorts had been ordered to stay close to the bomber formations, a defensive wall against German attacks. Doolittle tore up that rulebook. He ordered his pilots to go out and find the enemy and destroy him wherever he is. This unleashed chaos upon the Luftwaffe Mustang squadrons began sweeping far ahead of bomber formations. Ambushing German interceptors before they could organize, they strafed airfields, rail yards, and convoys, crippling the enemy's ability to fight before the battle even began. Doolittle's strategy was ruthless, but it worked by forcing the Luftwaffe into constant, uncoordinated combat. He bled them dry of their most valuable resource, veteran pilots. American airmen nicknamed it Fighter Freedom for the first time. They were not merely defending, they were on the attack even among German command. The results were clear. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, famously admitted after the war, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." That wasn't exaggeration, it was prophecy for both sides. The skies were more than a battlefield, they were a test of will in America. Newspapers printed stories of heroic bomber crews, of young men who defied death day after day. Propaganda posters showed smiling pilots beside their Mustangs. Promising victory was near. The air war became a symbol of industrial might and human courage combined in Germany. However, the propaganda began to crack. The myth of Luftwaffe invincibility, once the pride of the nation, was fading. Citizens in Berlin could now look up and see hundreds of contrails stretching across the sky, marking the path of bombers that no longer feared interception, even as the Allies pounded their cities. German civilians began to whisper what their leaders could not admit, that the skies no longer belonged to them. Among the Allied pilots, morale rose with every mission. Each successful escort meant fewer bombers lost, more men coming home alive. They painted kills on their fuselages, shared whiskey in the mess after missions, and toasted the Mustang, the Cadillac of the skies. The P-51 wasn't just a machine of war. It became a symbol of endurance, of technological triumph, of a promise that no distance was too far and no enemy too strong. By the time the spring of 1944 arrived, the stage was set. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, was cornered. Its pilots were exhausted, its fuel reserves collapsing, its command struggling to adapt. And on the horizon, the greatest air offensive of the war was preparing to unfold, one that would shatter German air power forever and open the skies for D-Day. March 6, 1944. It was still dark when the engines began to roar across the English countryside. Over 600 B-17s and B-24s stood lined across the runways of East Anglia, silver giants glinting under the dim floodlights. The target was Berlin itself, the heart of the Reich, the symbol of Nazi power. Until now, no Allied force had dared attempt a full daylight raid on the German capital. The Luftwaffe had sworn that no bomber would ever reach it alive, but this time, things were different. Above the bombers, hundreds of P-51 Mustangs took to the air. Their wings caught the morning light, shimmering like polished steel blades. The mission was simple: protect the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. As the massive formation crossed the Dutch coast, radar stations from Emden to Hanover screamed warnings across German air defense networks. Commanders scrambled every available fighter, Bf-109s, FW-190s, and even a few Me-410 heavy fighters within minutes. The sky was alive with black dots racing to intercept the Germans. It felt like routine. They had shredded bomber formations before, but as they climbed to engage, something felt wrong. The usual gap, the vulnerable stretch where American escorts had to turn back for fuel, never came. The bombers were still guarded, their silver escorts still circling above them from high altitude. The Mustang's dovet was like a storm breaking loose. The P-51s swept through the Luftwaffe formations at over 400 miles per hour. Their 50 caliber machine guns spitting fire. German pilots later recalled the shock, how the Americans seemed to be everywhere at once, attacking from above, below, and behind. One German squadron leader described it in his diary. "We saw them, sleek, fast, impossible to outclimb. The Mustangs came through us like lightning. I lost 2 men before I could even give an order." Dogfights erupted across the sky. Contrails twisted into violent spirals, forming ghostly white scars over the clouds. B-17s flew in disciplined rows below, their gunners firing at any fighter that came too close in the chaos. The Luftwaffe tried to regroup, but every attempt was crushed. The P-51s chased them relentlessly, following them even as they broke away and tried to dive home. American pilot Clarence Bud Anderson of the 357 Fighter Group later described the scene. "It was madness. We had them cold. You could see them panic, pulling too hard on the stick, blacking out, trying to dive for the deck, but there was no escaping the Mustang." By the time the bombers reached Berlin, the Luftwaffe's organized defense had collapsed. Anti-aircraft batteries thundered from the ground. But the skies, once Germany's greatest shield, were no longer theirs. Bombs fell across the city, hitting rail yards, factories, and even parts of the government quarter. Smoke rose in towering black columns, visible for miles. For the first time, Berliners watched in disbelief as American bombers passed overhead in broad daylight, unbroken, unafraid, and escorted every mile. Hermann Göring himself was at his command post that day, listening to radio reports as the situation unraveled. His fighter controllers tried desperately to coordinate reinforcements, but the chaos was overwhelming. Many Luftwaffe units never even made contact before being attacked on approach by roaming Mustangs. When Göring heard that P-51s were operating directly above Berlin, he reportedly turned pale and muttered, "If the Americans can do that, then we have lost the war." It was a stunning admission, and one that echoed the truth. That day, over 70 German fighters were destroyed, many with their pilots killed or captured. The 8th Air Force lost 69 bombers and 11 fighters, heavy losses, but a victory in strategic terms. The psychological damage to the Luftwaffe was irreparable. In the weeks that followed, the P-51s began to dominate every engagement. They hunted enemy aircraft across Germany, escorting bombers not just to Berlin, but to Leipzig, Regensburg, and even Vienna. Each new mission chipped away at the Luftwaffe's once proud fighter force. Their fuel reserves dwindled, their veteran pilots were gone, replaced by teenagers, barely out of training. By April 1944, the Germans were losing planes faster than they could build them. For the first time since 1939, the Luftwaffe was fighting on the defensive everywhere. The balance of power in the skies had shifted, and now, with the Luftwaffe crippled, the path was clear for the Allies. Greatest gamble, the invasion of Normandy, the thunder over Berlin, had been more than just another raid. It was the moment Germany lost control of its own airspace. Late February 1944, even before Berlin burned, the Allies launched a coordinated aerial onslaught known as Operation Argument, later remembered by its grim nickname, Big Week. For 7 relentless days, waves of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators bombed aircraft factories across Germany, Leipzig, Augsburg, Regensburg, and Stuttgart. The goal was simple but merciless: destroy the Luftwaffe on the ground and in the air. But this was not merely a bombing campaign, it was a trap. The Americans knew that to protect their production facilities, the Germans would have to send every available fighter into the air, and when they did, the P-51s would be waiting. The Mustangs, flying deep escort missions, roamed freely across the Reich, intercepting enemy aircraft before they could reach the bombers. their agility, firepower, and range turned what was once a defensive escort role into a devastating offensive weapon by the end of Big Week. The Luftwaffe had lost nearly 600 aircraft and hundreds of irreplaceable pilots. The Americans lost fewer than a quarter of that number in just 7 days. The myth of German air superiority was shattered. The most painful blow came not from machines, but from the loss of men. Germany's top fighter aces, many veterans from the Battle of Britain, were being cut down in the skies. They once ruled commanders like Walter Osaw and Wilhelm Lemke watched their squadrons vanish before their eyes. Each death meant not just a lost aircraft, but the loss of years of experience, tactical intuition, and mentorship. New recruits arrived straight from flight school, some with less than 100 hours of flight time. They were thrown into combat against veteran Mustang pilots who had mastered their craft over months of brutal fighting. The result was inevitable. Luftwaffe units were decimated within weeks. Even elite formations like JG-26 and JG-2, once the pride of Germany's western defenses, were reduced to fragments of their former strength. By March 1944, German high command admitted privately that the Luftwaffe could no longer guarantee air defense over critical regions. Factories were being bombed in daylight, fuel depots destroyed, and transport lines severed. The Reich skies, once a fortress, were collapsing from within, with aerial supremacy slipping away. The Americans pushed their advantage further. New orders were issued: destroy the Luftwaffe wherever you find it, in the air or on the ground. Mustang squadrons began sweeping across Germany in low-altitude attacks. They strafed airfields, hangars, fuel trucks, and parked aircraft with ruthless precision. Photographs from reconnaissance missions show scenes of devastation: airstrips littered with burning fighters, smoke curling into the winter sky. One P-51 pilot, Major Don Gentile of the 336th Fighter Squadron, became a legend for his daring attacks. He destroyed 30 enemy aircraft, many of them while strafing airfields at treetop height. His group's motto, "First in the air, first in the fight," became the spirit of the Mustang for the Luftwaffe. Even survival became a question of chance. Some German pilots refused to take off when they saw Mustangs circling overhead, knowing it meant almost certain death. Others tried to hide their planes under camouflage nets or inside barns. But the Americans were relentless. Every hidden aircraft eventually burned. By April 1944, the bombing of Berlin had become almost routine. The once invincible capital was now under daily attack, its factories crippled, its rail lines severed, and its skies filled with smoke. Citizens huddled in basements as sirens wailed across the city. The roar of engines overhead was constant and unending, thunder that symbolized Germany's decline. For the Luftwaffe pilots still flying, the despair was palpable. Veteran ace Adolf Galland later wrote, "We no longer controlled the air, we reacted. We survived, but we did not fight to win. The P-51 had taken the initiative, and with it, our pride." Even Gring's once powerful voice grew quiet. His promises of total victory sounded hollow against the reality outside. Every day, new reports arrived: more squadrons lost, more fuel shortages, more young pilots dead. The Luftwaffe, the force that had once terrorized Europe, was now fighting for its life, and losing. With German air defenses crippled, the Allies had achieved what seemed impossible just a year before: near total air supremacy over Western Europe. By May 1944, bombers could roam unchallenged from London to Leipzig. The Luftwaffe's attempts to interfere were sporadic and desperate. This dominance set the stage for Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy. In the weeks leading up to D-Day, Mustangs and other fighters swept across northern France, destroying radar sites, communication lines, and rail networks. They cleared the skies of any remaining German resistance, ensuring that when the first Allied troops stormed the beaches, No Luftwaffe aircraft would be there to strike them. The war in the air had been decided long before the first tank rolled onto Normandy's sands. It was decided in the cold skies above Germany when the P-51 appeared over Berlin and turned the tide of the entire conflict. The smoke from Berlin's burning rail yards still hung heavy in the air as the Allies prepared for their next great assault. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Europe, now struggled even to fly, and in that silence, after years of domination, Germany realized that the war it had once thought unwinnable had finally turned against it. By early 1944, the skies over Europe had changed forever. The once invincible Luftwaffe, whose pilots had mocked the slow-moving American bombers as flying coffins, was now reeling under relentless assault. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang turned every mission into a calculated disaster for Germany. The hunters had become the hunted. Each sortie drained Germany's strength. Luftwaffe units that had once dominated the skies from France to the Eastern Front were reduced to shattered squadrons limping home on fumes and fear in the hangars of occupied Europe. Mechanics stood among wrecked fuselages, their tools useless against the growing tide of attrition. By March 1944, the 8th Air Force had struck deep into Germany. Augsburg, Regensburg, Berlin. The P-51s escorted the bombers all the way there and back. For the first time, the Allies could strike the heart of the Reich in broad daylight. Confident their formations would survive, the numbers tell the story of collapse. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe lost about 34% of its fighter strength. By April, losses exceeded replacements by nearly double. Entire Staffeln, once symbols of German air superiority, ceased to exist within weeks in the skies above Berlin. Seasoned German aces met a new enemy they could not outfight. Range, coordination, and numbers. The Mustang stayed above 20,000 feet, diving in with devastating precision. P-47 Thunderbolts had been fast and tough, but the P-51s could fight at every altitude and chase the enemy home. The Luftwaffe's tactics, the climbing attacks, the head-on runs, failed against these escorts that simply would not leave. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most respected aces, described it bluntly: "We were outnumbered, outgunned, and eventually outflown." By mid-1944, fuel shortages compounded the crisis. Allied bombers, now shielded by Mustangs, targeted synthetic fuel plants at Luna, Merseburg, and Plitz. Every destroyed refinery meant fewer training hours, fewer sorties, fewer pilots surviving to fight again inside German command posts. Desperation replaced arrogance. The young men now climbing into cockpits were barely trained, sometimes with less than 100 flight hours. They flew into swarms of Mustangs commanded by veterans with hundreds of combat missions behind them. What began as the proud Luftwaffe of 1939 was now a broken arm of the German war machine, bleeding men faster than it could replace them. In the mess halls of the 8th Air Force, morale soared. For the first time, bomber crews spoke of reaching their targets and returning alive. Pilots painted Mustangs on their fuselages, confident symbols of power and protection. The psychological reversal was complete. The Americans now owned the air. When D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944, the P-51 swept across Normandy's skies. Unchallenged German aircraft barely appeared. The Luftwaffe had no fuel, no reserves, no confidence left to face the storm. Air superiority, once the dream of the Reich, had slipped completely into Allied hands. Every Allied bomb that fell on rail yards, bridges, and troop convoys in France bore the mark of that transformation. Without P-51s, there might never have been the scale of bombing that crippled the Wehrmacht's movement to the beaches. Without air dominance, D-Day itself could have been suicide. The Luftwaffe's pilots, once symbols of national pride, now faced impossible odds. Those who survived described endless fear of never returning, of burning in their machines, of watching comrades vanish in silent spirals of smoke for them. The war had turned from glory to endurance, and yet, amidst ruin, there were moments of grim respect. Allied and German pilots alike shared a bond few could understand. Men who fought in the sky, knowing death was a single burst of gunfire away. When the war finally ended, the skies above Europe were silent, littered with the ghosts of thousands of machines that once roared with purpose. The air war was won, but at a cost measured not just in wrecks and ruins, but in youth, courage, and memory, because what began as a battle for dominance had become a struggle for survival, and that struggle would now define what came next, the dawn of a new kind of warfare. Born from the ashes of the Luftwaffe's fall by late 1944, the Luftwaffe was fighting a war it could no longer sustain. The proud formations that had once ruled Europe's skies were now shadows of their former selves, grounded not by fear, but by emptiness. No fuel, no parts, no men. The P-51 Mustang had done more than escort bombers. It had dismantled an entire system, the aerial shield that had guarded Germany's heartland with every sortie. The Mustangs forced the Luftwaffe into combat it could not afford, bleeding it dry one mission at a time. The once feared Jagdgeschwader 26 and JG-54 Elite German fighter wings saw their rosters filled with boys barely out of flight school. The veterans were gone, killed, captured, or too exhausted to continue. Commanders wrote reports filled with quiet despair. "We have courage," one officer wrote, "but courage cannot outfly gasoline." For the Allies, it was vindication. General James Doolittle, commander of the 8th Air Force, had taken the controversial decision to release his escorts from close bomber protection. He told his Mustang pilots to seek, engage, and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found. It worked from January to May 1944. German fighter losses more than doubled by the summer. The Luftwaffe's strategic presence over Western Europe had collapsed. The shift was psychological as much as physical. Once, bomber crews had prayed for cloud cover. Now, they flew with confidence. When the P-51s showed up, one gunner recalled, "It was like angels on our wings." In Berlin, the truth could no longer be hidden. Production orders continued. Propaganda raged. But the skies told a different story. Allied bombers flew daily, sometimes thousands strong, hammering cities, factories, and railways. The capital of the Reich burned under daylight raids, a symbol of a war that could no longer be won. Even the famed Me-262 jet fighter, Germany's last hope, came too late and in too few numbers. Though faster than the Mustang, it was crippled by shortages of fuel and trained pilots. Allied fighters often caught them on takeoff or landing, when their vulnerable engines roared helplessly. By 1945, the once mighty Luftwaffe was barely functional. Of the 20,000 aircraft it fielded at its height, fewer than 2,000 were operational. The skies that had once echoed with the thunder of Messerschmitts were now ruled by the whine of Merlin engines, the sound of Allied dominance. And that dominance wasn't just tactical, it was transformative. It opened the way for the massive ground offensives of 1945. Allied troops advancing across the Rhine did so under skies utterly clear of enemy interference. P-51s strafed convoys, shredded trains, and destroyed any last hope of German mobility. Every bridgehead, every armored thrust toward Berlin depended on that air supremacy. The German people, too, felt the change. Where once the Luftwaffe had been their shield, now the roar of engines overhead brought only dread. Cities like Dresden, Hamburg, and Cologne bore witness to the fury of total air war, a concept perfected in those final years, when bombers and escorts worked in unbroken harmony. But behind the victory lay cost. The Allied bomber crews had suffered immense casualties before the P-51s arrived. Tens of thousands of men lost in daylight raids, even after the Mustang's debut. Flak and fighters still claimed many. The air war over Europe became one of attrition, measured in burned-out aircraft and folded flags still. The balance was undeniable when Germany finally surrendered in May 1945. It did so under skies completely owned by the enemy. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, existed only as scattered remnants, grounded and broken in the ruins of German airfields. Allied troops walked among the twisted remains of Me-109s and FW-190s. Bullet holes riddled the fuselages. Hangars stood empty on some walls. Painted slogans still read, "Victory is certain," but the silence that hung over those runways told the real story. The Luftwaffe had been defeated not by a single battle, but by relentless, methodical extinction, and at the center of that extinction was the P-51 Mustang, plane that changed the air war, the machine that made victory possible, the engine of the Allied sky. History often turns on machines, but the P-51 Mustang was more than just a machine. It was an idea, realized in metal, the belief that air superiority could end a war faster than any army could march for. The German pilots who once laughed at unescorted bombers. The arrival of the Mustang was more than a tactical shift. It was a revelation of defeat. Every flight over Berlin reminded them that the war they once dominated was no longer theirs to win. The hunters had become the hunted. The P-51 did not win the war alone, but it reshaped the air war's balance. Its speed, endurance, and deadly precision turned the skies into Allied territory. It gave the bombers what they had always needed: protection deep into enemy airspace. It gave soldiers on the fly round a shield from above, and it gave the Allies the confidence to carry the war to Germany's heart. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the Mustang remained a symbol of what relentless innovation and desperation could achieve. It embodied the unity of purpose that defined America's industrial and military will, born from British design, refined by American engineering, and perfected by the pilots who flew it. The P-51 became the ultimate weapon of cooperation, but its legacy wasn't only one of victory. It was also a warning. The air dominance that ended one war became the foundation of the next. The world had witnessed the full potential of strategic air power, and the destruction it could unleash. Cities had burned, generations were lost. Still, for those who fought in the air, the P-51 represented something deeply human: freedom, survival, the triumph of skill and courage in the most unforgiving environment imaginable. Today, when a P-51's Merlin engine roars to life at an airshow, veterans and historians alike pause, not just in nostalgia, but in awe. That sound once meant hope to bomber crews trapped in flak-filled skies. It meant the promise of returning home, and in that sound, echoing across the decades, lives the memory of the moment when the tide of war turned, the moment when the Mustangs appeared over Berlin, and the world below realized that the skies no longer belonged to the Reich.